Keith Howes, tell me what on earth possessed you to write a book about 70 years worth of the British history of film, television and radio. 1,000 pages.
To answer that question, William, we have to go back to the 1950s. A television set made of walnut arrived at my family home in October 1952. There was a Hopalong Cassidy Western as the first thing I ever saw, and I was attracted to Hopalong's very tight white trousers. And you could say I was glued from that moment on. And it was not very fashionable to like television, or indeed to even have a television in 1952, because it was very much relegated to the idea that it was something the servants looked at, that polite people, respectable people, intelligent people, they went to the theatre. Sometimes to the cinema, but mainly to the theatre, and of course they read books. They did not watch a screen. Well, I did, and it became part of my life, part of my education, part of my enlightenment. And part of that was, of course, seeing aspects of queerdom, including a female impersonator called Bobby Kimber, who was on children's television. He used to play cat roles like, a Girl Guide leader or a fortune teller. And one day I said to my mother, it would have been about 6 years old, I said, Mummy, why is that man allowed to wear women's clothes? And quick as a flash, my mother said, well, he has to go to the police station to get a special license. I thought, oh, really? And I filed that one away in my child's filing cabinet, thinking, oh, well, you never know, I might wish to do that.
So television was quite an education for you?
It was an education, as was radio. You've got to remember that when television began in Britain in 1936, it was purely the British Broadcasting Corporation. There was no other radio or television channel. So when I got television in 1952, we only watched BBC programs, and in fact we didn't actually have commercial television until 1963, so I missed 3 years of Coronation Street. Can you imagine that?
Heavens to Betsy.
Pardon?
Heavens to Betsy.
Heavens to Betsy. Heavens to Bet Lynch. So in answer to your question, in a way, I was always going to write an encyclopaedia of gay television, radio and film, because I was gay from a very early age, and I loved radio and television and film. And more to the point, so did my family. There was no restriction on the amount of television I watched, or indeed the amount of radio that I watched.
Really?
Of course, I had to go to bed, which was sometimes a source of great annoyance to me, but we watched as a family, remember? This was a family entertainment. Television basically began with children's television at 5 to 6. Then there was an hour where television stopped. This was to get the babbies ready for their baths and their beddy buys and things like that. And then the television service began again at 7 o'clock and went on till about 10:30, 11 o'clock. And that was it. That was the 7 days a week.
So did you find it quite liberating?
I found it enormously liberating because, as I said, I was seeing little aspects of something I couldn't quite put my finger on, actually visible in my home. And of course it's so much easier when you're watching it with a family, where the family say things that indicate perhaps a more adult perspective. When you go to the cinema, people are basically quiet, so you might see something in a film, but it's not really discussed at that moment. And you've got to remember that television was live in those days. There was virtually no telerecording, so you had this wonderful situation where you have an actor like Trevor Howard from Brief Encounters, and he was closing the door, he was opening the door rather, and as he opened the door, he said, and it was murder, just as if you killed him yourself. But the kids couldn't get the door open. It was murder, just as if you killed him yourself. And of course he couldn't get out of the door. And because it was live, there was no way it could be retaken. And people would faint on camera because of the hot lights. They would, of course, fluff their lines absolutely magnificently and do all sorts of crazy things. So it was a fun, it was a kind of experiment. It wasn't finished, and of course the television service itself was always breaking down. There were lines coming up and down the screen would go dark, normal service will be resumed as soon as possible. It was just crazy. Yeah, it wasn't the finished, polished product that we see today.
But as fascinating as your story is, a lot of people grew up on TV and have great memories, and they have those television memories from their youth, and you were there in the early days of television when it started becoming popular. But they haven't all gone on to write 1,000-page books. Why you? Why this book?
I'll tell you exactly what it was, and it had to do with my mother, who I mentioned. My mother was the queen of camp. On Sunday nights on BBC, they would have a play called the Sunday Night Theatre, and my mother would actually get into evening dress to watch it because she felt that, you know, there was a sense of occasion. And of course, they had an interval, and the announcers, you've got to remember, the announcers were all in evening dress. The females were all in lovely gowns, and the men wore proper bow ties and evening jackets. So there was a sense of occasion. So my mother died. She died in 1987, and I was left some money. And I just suddenly thought, I know what I'm going to do. I want to have a book which I would want to read. I would want to have a book that would tell me the history of gays and lesbians on British television and radio. And such a book didn't exist. I went into Gays the Word in the early 80s, and I said to the then manager, you know, do you have a book on gays and television? You know, it didn't matter what country, America, Canada, you know, Barbados. But no, there was nothing. And what struck me was how he looked at me as though, well, why on earth would anyone be interested in television? You know, like, there haven't been any gays on television except Quentin Crisp and a few other people like that. Well, because that's not true. And how else would I have been able to fill 1,000 pages if there hadn't been all these amazing representations?
Can you show us the cover?
Oh, the cover. Well, the cover's rather strange, actually. It's got 3 young men.
Friends of yours?
No. I'll tell you about the cover a bit later on. There's a story behind the cover. But it's called Broadcasting It. But it wasn't originally called Broadcasting It. It was originally called Close to Home. And it was a history. It was actually a narrative history of gay broadcasting. And I sent it to quite a few publishers from about 1980. And they all said, who would be interested in reading a book on gay TV? So in a way, they were amplifying what the manager of Gays the Word had told me. But, you know, when you're passionate about something, you never give up. And I suddenly thought, how about the Open University? Because at that time, we're coming into the 90s now, there was much more awareness of gay cultural history, queer history, etc. And I thought, well, the university, the Open University, surely should do something on this enormous slice of cultural history, which goes back, of course, to the late 30s, the late 20s, because broadcasting actually began in 1922. So we're coming up really for its centenary. And I sent it to, I spoke to the one of the managing editors, and he was very enthusiastic. So I sent it off. This was close to home. This was the history of gay broadcasting. That same week, he sent me a letter saying, oh, don't bother to send it. Because of economic strictures, we've had to cut back on our cultural publishing. I just burst into tears. I just cried for a quarter of an hour, and I suddenly thought, I'm going to write an encyclopedia. I'm going to change it. I'm going to do what I want to do.
So how much had you written already?
I'd written the whole book.
The whole book?
Yeah, so it does exist. There is a book called Close to Home.
Which will never be published?
Which will never be published, no. But it you know, lots of writers write books, don't they?
And it was more of a narrative?
Yeah.
Wow. And how much of this version, Broadcasting It, was based on that?
Oh, a lot, yes. Because I decided to go with the actual programs rather than the people that made the programs. I made that decision for 2 reasons. One, I was by that time living in Australia, and I was writing a book about British television. So it was more difficult for me to actually, and this was before the internet, remember, this was in 1987 when I began writing the book. And so as I said, I just started writing a book that I wanted to read, and I based it on Leslie Halliwell's film and TV guides, which were hugely popular. They've been popular really since the 1970s, and I love them because it had all sorts of minutiae about the actual programs, about the directors, about the actors, and it would take the subjects of certain films and put like umbrellas, where did umbrellas, where did umbrellas come into films and television? So I thought, well, I'll do that. And kind of I thought, well, it's mum's money. So it meant I didn't have to work for a bit. I was able to write.
And you were writing the book in Australia?
I was writing the book
This
in
is
Australia.
before the age of the internet?
And I'm so glad I was in Australia, because if I'd been in England, I'd be watching television and listening to radio and not actually writing the book. But because I was in Australia, not to say that Australian television and radio were poor, because you've got to remember that Australia was a pioneer with gay television, with Number 96, and with lesbian television, with Prisoner Cell Block H. So Australia certainly appears in broadcasting. It's very important.
But how did you get your information?
I got my information by going to Radio Times, absolutely vital. When I was in England, I would go to the library in St Martin's Lane and go through. They had a whole backlog of Radio Times. The Listener was also very important. I'd go to the library here, the State Library of New South Wales, a lot of information. I also asked a couple of people in England to do some research for me there. But of course it wasn't the same as it would be now, where you get the cast lists and you get all the critics' opinion. It was much more difficult to do. But the most important thing of all was I went to the BBC and I met one of the BBC librarians called Irene Basterfield. And she welcomed me with open arms. She said, we've got this list of plays and programs, but it's a tiny list. She said, I'm sure there's more. So I was able to sit in the archives for 3 months during one very hot summer, I think it was 1988, and eventually give Irene this huge list, because I was reading all the scripts. Because a lot of the plays, of course, didn't exist, particularly the plays from the 1930s to the 1950s. You've got to remember that videotape was very expensive in those days. So although there were things called tele-recordings, they were basically, you put a 35mm camera in front of the television monitor and that was it. Then when videotape came in the 60s, it was very, very expensive. So much has got wiped. It is extraordinary. Some of the great plays no longer exist.
So was some of it written about your own memories?
Oh, definitely. If I hadn't have been watching television, and we're talking about the BBC, very intently, and listening to radio, I wouldn't have been able to pick up on all the references in, for example, the radio serials, The Archers and Mrs. Dale's Diary, which are absolutely awash with queer references. So I was able to go back into the archives to read the scripts and go, yes, exactly. I was only 6 years old, but my gaydar was obviously working.
Did your sister help in any way?
My sister helped later on. My sister, of course, was my great cultural advisor while I was growing up. She was 14 years old when I was born. She was very into popular music. She was also into films and television and radio. One of her favourite shows was The Goon Show. And The Goon Show was this very amazingly irreverent and radical and gender crazy program with Spike Milligan, Peter Sellers, originally Michael Bentine and then Harry Seacombe. And I used to sit and listen to it with her every Monday night, I think it was. I didn't understand a lot of it, but she laughed, and so I laughed as well. You have to pretend, don't you, that you're a bit more adult than you really are. So she was a great help, but she came into her own actually after my mother died, because she lived next door. She lives in Royston, in Hertfordshire, next door to the transmitter at Sandy. And that is the BBC transmitter. So of course she was able to get pristine quality video recordings of all the programs. I would read the Radio Times. The Radio Times was sent to me by airmail. I would read the Radio Times and then ask her to record. So she'd be getting up at 8 in the morning to record some film,
And did she send the VHS tapes here?
She did. She was incredible. Absolutely.
That's dedication.
And she did the radio stuff as well. So she was doing audio as well. She was racing from The Archers to Queer as Folk.
That's impressive. That's quite a feat.
She deserves an honorary gay award. She is the least gay and lesbian person I've ever met, but the most non-judgmental and pro-gay and lesbian person I've ever met.
Now, how did you go about finding a publisher?
Well, as I told you, the Open University more or less just squashed the idea, and of course I knew they wouldn't be interested in an encyclopedia. But I had sent the book, i.e. close to home, to Michael Mason. Michael Mason had been my colleague at Gay News. I was the features editor of Gay News, London Gay News. It was the paper for homosexuals. It was a bi-monthly newspaper and magazine, and Michael was the news editor. And I'd sent it to him just to say, Michael, here is the book that I've been talking to him about for years. Now, I have to also thank Michael, and particularly the editor of Gay News, Dennis Lemon, because when I went to work for Gay News, middle of the 1970s, I said to Dennis, look, there's a lot of TV and radio. Do you want me to cover it? He said, yeah, sure, of course. He couldn't have been more encouraging. And at the end of 1977, he let me do a two-part history of gays on British television. And the first part was in the issue that sold more issues than any other of Gay News. So there was I knew there was obviously a need, an audience out there for this subject. But of course I didn't quite know how to put it across because, as I said, so many of the productions didn't exist anymore. They'd gone into thin air. So I sent it to Michael, and Steve Cook, who was the commissioning editor for a series of gay and lesbian books for Castle, the publisher Castle, was looking for titles. And Michael said, well, why don't you contact Keith Howes? He's written this history of gays. But of course, by the time Steve contacted me, it had changed. It was no longer close to home. It was broadcasting it. So poor old Steve was landed with this huge encyclopedia. Now, I got a huge amount of money, £5,000.
Wow.
Which for a first-time author was incredible.
And back then, very
back
good.
Then, it was huge. And I owe Steve a huge debt because this was a subject that had never been done before. It was done in an encyclopedic way. It was only British television and radio, so obviously that limited its sales. There were no photographs in it, because I couldn't afford by that time to pay for the copyright. So we're talking about 1,000 pages, 2,000 entries, a massive amount of work. And of course I was freaking out because when you actually come to do it, you have to check every fact, you have to make sure that your opinions are, they have a certain gravitas to them, because this is when you write an encyclopedia, this isn't just for this year, it's for ever. This is a doorstep. It's a doorstep book, it's a source book for others that will come after you.
What was the reaction to the book?
Pretty good. It was published at Christmas 1993, and it got some good reviews, and it did well, sort of well in the Christmas market. The problem was the American market wasn't a bit interested, because as soon as you put UK on the front cover of a book, America doesn't want to know. But we had to do that because it was purely UK radio. We did do a lot of American TV series, but to be honest to the title, you had to put United Kingdom. So Castle basically lost a lot of money, and unfortunately a number of books that they would have commissioned probably weren't commissioned because of the failure, not just of broadcasting it commercially, but of other books as well, which I think is a great shame. There was a book I know on gay children's television.
Really?
Which has never seen the light of day, which would have done if broadcasting it and other books had made more of a dent in the market.
How does that make you feel?
That particular book, I feel very sad about. I met the author of it, a young man, Richard somebody, I can't remember his other name. He did show me a little of it. I feel that there should have been a book on children's television. I think it's absolutely essential. And also, I believe there should have been a follow-up to Stephen Bourne's book, Brief Encounters, which was another revelation because he dealt with gays in British films. Now, of course, Vito Russo had dealt with films, but mainly American. Stephen was the first person to open up British cinema. The book went up, I think, to the 1970s, and it should have had a follow-up. There should have been one covering the 80s and 90s and into the 21st century. That never happened. The children's television book never happened. I'm sure there were others which they just didn't get there. The They put a lot of money, Castle put a lot of money into it. Castle then was sold to another publisher. They were talking about doing a digital version of broadcasting it, but that didn't happen. They were talking about doing a concise version. Again, that fell on fallow ground. So it was a gamble that Steve and Castle took, and I'm afraid it didn't pay off. However, we have broadcasting it, and it's still available through presumably Amazon and places like that. And it's on the reading lists of many queer, gay and lesbian media courses, and also, I hope, on courses about British television and radio, because it's the only book on radio and television. It's giving radio the same importance as television. That, I think, is virtually unique.
Could you write a sequel? Will you?
No, it's impossible. This book finished in 1993. 1993 was a very important year. We'd seen the end of Margaret Thatcher's government, of course, at the end of the 1980s. We had John Major. AIDS was just beginning to come under control. We were just beginning to get the first of the drug cocktails, because this book was written during the AIDS crisis, which was terrifying. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Every week in the gay newspapers there'd be a whole page of obituaries of these young men born in the 1960s, the 1970s. Unbelievable, they were so young. So, it was a very tense time, but in a way, it's a time capsule. What happened? We had, of course, wonderful productions during the 90s, culminating in Russell T Davies' Queer as Folk, which was an explosion. We hadn't anticipated anything like Queer as Folk. It was so frank, it was so bold, it was so brazen, it was so ballsy, and of course it encompassed the northern part of Britain, which had only really been properly encompassed by Coronation Street, which of course was created by a gay man, Tony Warren. So we were in a revolution, but then there was another revolution, and it was called the internet. It was called streaming. It was called home box office. It was called Netflix. Suddenly, it was too much, just too much. And of course, radio didn't just shrivel up and die. Radio continued, and we still have lots of radio series. We have The Archers, of course, that's carried on. We've had lots of gay characters in The Archers. We've had a return of one of the lesbian characters. But frankly, it was too exhausting. I must tell you that when Broadcasting It was published, I thought I was going to be giving talk after talk after talk. I was going to be on the lecture circuit. I was going to be the expert. Nothing happened.
Nothing at all.
And let's face it, why should it? I wasn't an academic. I'd never gone into the academic world. I have no letters after my name. I hadn't done a degree. Why should the academic world embrace me?
How did it make you feel?
Very depressed at the time. I went into a completely new line of work. I became a bush regenerator. I suddenly was out there in the heat with the flies, with the ants, with the spiders, and working with the native flora and fauna of New South Wales. And then in 2001, I discovered a new passion. And that took me into an entirely new direction, which I won't talk about now. We'll maybe do another conversation on that. But yeah, I was very depressed for about a year because I had expected, I suppose, a recognition that I didn't get. And of course I didn't get to write the sequel. I was really hoping that we would at least have a book to take us to the end of the 90s. That didn't happen because Castle had moved. It was no longer Castle. It was taken over by Contour. And Stephen Bourne didn't get to write Brief Encounters, but he went on to write many wonderful books about the black community in Britain, which have become classics. And Stephen and I moved on together concurrently, working with our dream, and our dream was a documentary about gays and lesbians on British television. That is still awaiting production. We live in hope that one day, we also live in hope that Stephen's brilliant series of showing actual programs, which is called Out of the Archives, that went on from 1992 to 2001, not only will be revived by the British Film Institute, but will go across Britain. It'll actually be taken across Britain. We also need a channel, like we have Talking Pictures. We need a channel devoted to the classics of gay and lesbian British television.
Could such a book be written today?
Yes, I think it could. I think it would be much easier to write today because you've got the internet, you've got the wonderful international movie database which covers, television and film. Radio is still difficult because you've actually got to winkle out all the reference. You've got to remember that broadcasting isn't just about soap operas and drama. It's actually about documentary, news programs, pop programs, Top of the Pops. It includes references which are minute, but you've got to remember also that there was no censorship on what you could say about gay people. You could say anything you like. I remember speaking at a conference the same week that gay people in a survey were listed on the same level as members of the IRA, 1984. Because of AIDS, we were seen again as this horrible group of people that brought, disease and distemper to the whole innocent heterosexual population. I mean, this book is written in blood, really. Although it's all very neat and tidy and lovely, there was a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of stupidity, a lot of ignorance, and it's so wonderful that now we have, my dream come true, a concise, that means small, book on the history, i.e. from the 1930s to the 1980s, on gay men, on British TV. Now, I have a feeling you might be asking, what about lesbians?
Yes.
What about lesbians?
What about the lesbians?
Well, they're in broadcasting. Lesbian broadcasting, radio and television is absolutely in this book. Have lesbians taken a leaf from this book? Have they written a book about it? Have they written articles? Not that I can see. When the lesbian character returned to the Archers, Diva made no mention. Diva is the lesbian magazine, a kind of a female version of Gay Times, I suppose. It's disappointing because there is some wonderful lesbian stuff, a wonderful lesbian actress named Mary Morris. Also, you've got Jacqueline Mackenzie, who became Jackie Forster of Sappho magazine, and many writers like Patrice Chaplin, Diana Suhami. You've got the wonderful lesbian police officer in Dixon of Dock Green. She was in it from 1956 to 1962, based on a real lesbian WPC. Where is it? Where is the lesbian history? We await it.
What advice would you give the young Keith Howes who was writing broadcasting it that you have now?
I would say that the young Keith Howes was always going to write broadcasting it. The young Keith Howes was always going to love television and radio because his family loved television and radio. There was no shame attached to loving that, or cinema, or opera, or ballet. I came from a very culturally rich family who were born poor. Born very poor, didn't have the opportunities that I was able to have in the 1950s and 1960s. So I lived in a world of encouragement at home, but of discouragement outside. I think the combination of the gay gave it the history, the dynamic that it needs and still has. I think gay is still very sexy, it's still very disturbing to people, which makes it a very interesting and entertaining subject. I think there's masses more to be written. I hope that many writers will use broadcasting it as their source material, and there'll be many more books like Stephen's.
What do you wish you'd done differently?
Nothing really. Honestly, I think that I was meant to write the encyclopaedia. I don't think I was meant to write a history. I think the history should have been written. It should have been written, but it should have been written talking to the directors and the actors and the producers of that era. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to do that. And I think that we missed a huge opportunity because most of those people are dead. I'm talking about people like John Hopkins, Simon Gray, Ned Sherrin of That Was the Week That Was, the creators of The Archers, the creators of Mrs. Dale's Diary. We've missed a golden opportunity to talk to them. They must have had huge difficulties getting that material through. Because remember, BBC censorship forbade any discussion of any controversial subjects at all until the beginning of, well, the end of the 50s, when the Wolfenden report was published on homosexuality. That's when you could finally mention homosexuality.
A couple more questions. What were the and you have touched upon them, what were the greatest challenges of writing broadcasting it?
Sanity and my relationship with Peter, which suffered tremendously because I just was totally absorbed.
Peter was your partner?
Peter was my partner. He was wonderful, but He had a very, very difficult working life. He wanted to come back to a home that was, settled and tidy, and it was a mess. There were bits of paper all over the place, and I became a walking encyclopedia because I knew I had a real responsibility to the community to do a really good book. I wanted it to be an equivalent to Leslie Halliwell. This was the gay Leslie Halliwell. And so in terms of the relationship, no, I didn't give to the relationship. Finally, I even took a couple of Valium, which I've never taken in my life before I got so hung up and so in a spiral. Because, 1,000 pages is a lot. And each subject had to be dealt with in a consistent style. One of the good things about broadcasting, it's written by one person. So you've got one person's view all the way through. But boy, did it hurt my brain.
What did you enjoy most about writing Broadcasting It?
Well, I love looking at all the material I was able to look at. Of course, receiving all the new stuff from Britain. Remember, EastEnders was in its prime in the mid to late 80s. We had the whole relationship between the Michael Cashman character and his boyfriend. So in a way, it gave me a link to Britain because I was quite homesick. And I just love gay television and radio. I just love it. I still get a thrill. I'd love to go back and really review some of the material, but of course I'm doing another project now, so that's in the past. But I feel very confident of the future because I think Stephen's book is going to generate a lot of interest, and the fact that he's got this wonderful backing from Russell Davis, from Mark Gatiss, Peter Tatchell, Michael Cashman, it's just going to blossom. I really think it's going to be a huge success.
Final question. Occasionally, I'll be in bookshops in London or the UK and I will see Broadcasting It on the shelves. Why should somebody buy your book and read it now in 2019, 2020?
It's the book I always wanted to read. When I read it, I read it and read it and read it. I can't put it down. And it's my book. I thought, who on earth wrote this book? Is this really good? And it was me. So I wanted to write a book that I myself would want to read. And in 2019, I still am reading Broadcasting It because it's so full of impactful information about a forbidden subject. Remember, this was a forbidden world of perverts and people that you wouldn't want in your family. These are people that were rejected, reviled, put in prison, and here they are in all the nooks and crannies of all the documentaries, the plays, the musical variety shows, and it's all there in full panoply between these pink covers.
Keith Howes, author of Broadcasting It, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, William, and cheers to all Broadcasting It fans. I nearly forgot, because I mentioned it earlier, didn't I, that I was going to tell you about the cover image of Broadcasting It. And you've got to remember that Broadcasting It was a big deal back in 1992 when it was accepted by Castle. There had never been an encyclopedia of television and gays, let alone television, radio and film on gays. And just to put you in the context, this was the Encyclopaedia of Homosexuality that was published in America in 1990. Now, it's a 2-volume work, very big. Television got 2 pages or 3 pages, and it was just American television. And this was British television and radio together with film. So here was a 1,000-page encyclopedia. It was massive. So Castle was putting a lot of effort and a lot of money into this book. I'm sure anyone that's ever written a book has always been very concerned about the cover, because the cover often sells the book. So I was really looking forward to a very, very stylish cover. And they sent me this, which is 3 drag queens in black and white. What's that got to do with television, radio and film? And I protested, but they more or less said, well, look, we've spent the budget. We haven't got any more money to design a cover. I think this was a photograph that someone connected to the publisher took, so they didn't have to pay any money for it. So I was lumbered with it, and the book was, shall we say, a disappointment, because although it was well reviewed, it didn't sell particularly well. And Castle had a lot riding on it, because they thought a book like this was going to really be a classic. It didn't sell in America because it was UK television and UK radio, and it didn't have any pictures in it, and it had this cover. So I always felt a little bit shortchanged, until very recently somebody contacted somebody who I know on Facebook and said, "That's us, that's us." We were a group called Hell on Heels, and this picture was taken at a 1990 Pride Festival. And these are the people. In the middle, we have Polara Lansbury. On the left, we have Chris Lamont, and on the right, David Desire. So I finally discovered who were broadcasting it.